and Walter Weglin. And as many of you know, this conference represents the kickoff of the Michi and Weglin Endowed Chair for Multicultural Studies, and it's of that term for over 40 years. And she has been active not only in the Asian American community, but also in the African American community, the Latino community, and in any community or for any person that is struggling for justice and human rights. In short, her life exemplifies the theme of your conference: coalition building, community formation, and activism. Your conference program contains a brief bio on Yuri that highlights some of her major activities, including her many years of activism with Malcolm X. Since I assume all of you know how to read, I'm not going to repeat all of that. Instead, I'd like to do a more personal introduction of Yuri. Yuri was born and raised in San Pedro, just a few dozen miles southwest of here. She and her family were sent to the concentration camp in Arkansas during World War II. After the war, she married Bill Kochiyama, a 442nd veteran, and moved to New York City. My wife Agnes and I first met Yuri and Bill around 1970, when the two of us were very involved in a national campaign to repeal Title II of the McCarran Act, otherwise known as the Emergency Detention Act of 1950. This law basically enabled the government to take action similar to that taken against Japanese Americans during World War II, and to arbitrarily round up people they thought were a threat to the internal security of the United States. Sounds a bit familiar today, doesn't it? Of course, Bill and Yuri were already involved with this campaign. By that time, they had been involved for many years in the African American community, working on various civil and human rights issues affecting that community. Becoming involved in the Title II campaign was yet another issue they became committed to. You know, Yuri and Bill have never been well off financially, and I'm sure never aspired to become so. That was not a priority for them. Yuri worked in a restaurant for many years and occasionally taught Asian American Studies part-time in the CUNY system in New York City. At the same time, both of them were raising their 6 children. They lived for many years in a low-income high-rise housing project in Harlem. Agnes and I, with our 3 children in tow, visited them in their very modest and small apartment a number of times, and even stayed overnight there a couple of times. Their apartment was Grand Central Station, with people coming and going at all times of the day, but they never turned anyone away if they needed a place to stay, including our family of 5. I mention all of this because when Yuri talks so passionately about the working class and the oppressed underclass, it's not just social rhetoric for her, but a deeply felt empathy because of the way she has lived her own life. Her social activism is not just a pastime that she occasionally dabbles in when she has the time, but an ongoing, integral part of her everyday life. And here she is at the age of 81, speaking as passionately as ever about the need for all of us to work together to change the world, to make it a better place for all of us. As I said, I don't believe there's a more appropriate person to be the keynote speaker of your conference. So it's a pleasure and an honor for me to present your keynote speaker, Yuri Kochiyama.
First, I want to thank you, President Bob Suzuki. I mean, my God, he really went overboard with his introduction. And it's so wonderful to see Agnes. I mean, we go back so long. And I want to then thank your conference organizer, where is she? Mary Udonico. And the co-counselor, Linda, was it Vogt? Yes. Linda Vogt. And all of you others who had any part in this organizing. I see some of them sitting right here. I am so delighted and honored to come here to remember and honor two illustrious, inspiring figures, Michi Nishiura Weglan and her husband, Walter Weglan. In many ways, they evoke the very theme for your conference, crossing boundaries, coalition building, community formation, and activism. Michi and Walter certainly crossed boundaries. As both left their own ethnic group, Michi, a Japanese American who grew up in a farm in California, was sent to an internment camp in the Gila River, Arizona desert, where sandstorms damaged her lung, and Michi ended up in a TB sanitarium in New York. She was a charming woman of many talents, which she had to give up, but she even worked for the famous singer, pop singer, Perry Como. After returning from the sanitarium, she crossed some more boundaries by marrying Walter Weglan, a Jewish man who also crossed boundaries because intermarriages at that time were prohibited in most states. Walter, whose family endured frightening experiences losing members of his family to Hitler's order, and which led to the concentration camps and death, where 6 million Jews were killed. But both helped each other to understand the experiences of two very different people, the Jews in Europe and the Japanese Americans in the US. Their coalition building was more of a personal nature, building their own strong relationships by learning of each other's World II experiences. They also were part of each other's community formation, being active, knowing what was happening in their both worlds. They were both unpretentious, genuine internationalists who were lovingly admired by those who knew them. Michi's most remembered accomplishment was undergoing 12 years of research to publish her highly valued book, Years of Infamy. And if you have not read it, please, please do. Crossing boundaries is something that each of you have always been doing since you were a child. You have crossed boundaries when you went from junior high school to high school, from high school to college, and every time you changed from one boyfriend or girlfriend to another. You crossed emotional boundaries, social boundaries. Every time you made a decision to do something, every time you experience something new, and you will be crossing more and more boundaries as you go on with your life. And each time you will learn lessons about life and people. Crossing boundaries is part of all of our lives. You will have to cross boundaries to go on to the next phase of your life. Most all of our parents and grandparents, if we are Asian, passed boundaries in coming to a new country, learning to adapt to a new environment and language. And it wasn't just physical or regional, it was mental and sometimes imaginary, but also racist. Again, I mean, Asians, like all people of color, also had to protect boundaries against racism. It was often with building coalitions with blacks, Latinos, American Indians, and progressive whites. It was also done with community formations with groups like the Black Panthers, Young Lords, and Iwakun, and Red Guards. Boundaries have been crossed by Africans and Asians, and Latinos and Asians, and whites and Asians. In 1965, China sent thousands of workers to Africa to help build the Tanzan Railway from Zambia to Tanzania. About the same time, Korea sent thousands of workers to Zimbabwe to help build the largest athletic stadium in Africa. On the other hand, Ho Chi Minh came here to the US, was so impressed with the Black Garvey movement that he donated whatever he could, and at that time, he didn't have that much. When the 42-member, I can't think of the real name, but I'm calling it the US-Japan Anti-Arms Proliferation Group, came to America and ran out of money, which was generously given by internationally known white peace activist Barbara Reynolds. But it was Dick Gregory, the famed black comedian, who joined the group in Chicago, hearing that they were in trouble, and raised money in New York City, and even in New York City and Chicago, and accompanied them through Europe, raising money till the Japanese group, who were all hibakshas, atom bomb victims, reached the Soviet Union. The purpose was to stop the proliferation of arms. When the hibakshas were in New York, 3 Japanese reporters in the group said they wanted to meet Malcolm more than anyone else in America. We asked his newly formed group at that time, MMI, Muslim Mosque Incorporated, if Malcolm would be willing to meet the hibakshas. People told us, he won't do it. Why should he? He doesn't know any of you. And it was a very, very dangerous time for him. For 6 months later, he would be assassinated. But on June 6, 1964, he came. We couldn't believe it. Our place was packed because the word went round by mouth that Malcolm X might be here. Most of the people were either black or white who were members of the civil rights movement. There were blacks, but not one of them were Malcolm's type of blacks. They were not nationalists, they were not Muslims, they were not Yorubas, they were not black radicals, just integrationists. Even the people who came wondered how he would treat them. But they were amazed at what a gentleman he was, and he was as warm to the whites as to blacks. It was a beautiful scene to see all of them interacting, Japanese, whites, blacks, and and peace activists. People could not believe that the media demonized Malcolm was such a different kind of person. In Ghana in 1964, the Chinese ambassador invited Malcolm to China. because Malcolm admired Mao Zedong. He wanted to go, but he had too many commitments. So the Chinese ambassador then asked Vicky Garvin. Vicky Garvin was a very well-known black woman activist. Vicky said yes, she'll go, and she thought she might stay a few weeks, but Vicky stayed 10 years in China. And she married, not a Chinese, but a white communist Maoist. Now, go back to page 2, I'm sorry. But crossing boundaries has not always been a good thing. Some people have crossed boundaries to take over other people's lands and resources. Look at U.S. history. When Europeans crossed boundaries to come to this new land, America, the European immigrants ended up with the annihilation of the indigenous and the enslavement of Africans. Also, U.S.'s war with Mexico, which was another offensive boundary crossing, concluded with half of Mexican land become taken by the U.S. to become Texas, California, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Arizona. Well, where do I go from here? Wow. What country today is crossing boundaries, and not for any good reason, but sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers, Marines, Air Forcemen, and blitzkrieging, bombing a small Arab country on the rumor that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. But what country really has all the weapons, who has supplied the whole world with weapons, and also supplied both Iraq and Iran when they were fighting each other in the grueling 8 years war in the 80s. U.S. egged them both to see both sides try to destroy each other. In 1990-91, U.S. bombed Iraq to near death in 42 days. The U.S. wiped out 200,000 Iraqi soldiers who had already run out of ammunition because U.S. had destroyed everything: electric plants, water supply, roads, hospitals, etc. The Iraq soldiers were holding up white surrender flags, but the U.S. Air Force mowed down every single one of the Iraqi Republican Army. And after that bloody war, what does U.S. do but put sanctions on Iraq? And 500,000 infants and children died of lack of medication and food. And now U.S. is at Iraq again for the same reason, that U.S. blow up strategic areas in Afghanistan for oil and fuel, and setting up U.S. bases in the Middle East. U.S. greed, arrogance, and hunger for power wants to control the world's largest oil resources, although she has a lot right here in America and Alaska. She will then make the world her empire. U.S. strategies always includes first demonizing a leader or country, lying to her own people, accusing oppositions, then recklessly invading and devastating as if it was in retaliation for a wrong done to them. 9/11 will remain a day of infamy to the U.S. like December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan. But like every war that U.S. has engaged in the 20th century, there were no surprise attacks, and neither was 9/11. Investigators and researchers have found too many holes in the stories about the Muslim hijackers having smashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Some of them may have, but 9/11 was no surprise attack. U.S. will never reveal how 9/11 happened, but the truth will become known incrementally from sources other than the government, period. Researchers feel the real culprit was not Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan or Saddam Hussein or Muslims. It was the cleverest terrorists, the self-righteous, arrogant team of Bush and his cabinet. For this in a long prepared war. Oh, now I hope I find the next page. What must we Asian Americans do? But it's not just what Asian Americans do, but it's what everybody must do. What needs to be done? Human beings from whatever part of this world might show the terror machine that it must be dismantled, that right or might does not make right. A new world must be created. New minds must be nourished from infanthood, that all humanity are connected, are related, that we are all equals, though our talents may be different, but we can all contribute, that all the necessities of life can be accessible to all. No one must be recognized as better or less than another. We were never meant to be alike. We are not clones. Our differences may be our color, our race, our culture, our language, our traditions, our histories. But we must see each other as important components in this vast world. We are, or should be, independent, dependent, and interdependent. Every individual is precious. Thus, every national and racial grouping is precious. Every life is sacred. We were given a mind to think, given a heart to feel. We must learn, and given eyes and ears to see and learn. We must learn by mistake. Humankind's history is full of mistakes and left the ugly legacy of war after war, greed, brutality, pain, and suffering. We must first transform ourselves and then try to transform this world. Every child must experience love and kindness while young, that he or she can pass love and kindness to members of their family and the world. Did I read that before? Oh, yeah. Let's cross boundaries to do good, not evil. Let's build coalitions that we can work together. Let's begin community formation to help anyone in our communities who are in need. Let's make activism a part of our life if and when time, health, and other factors permit. In closing, let's remember Michi and Walter Wegland, whose lives impacted so many because they loved all humanity. Thank you, Mary Donico, Linda, Vo, and all the committee members who worked and organized this most fulfilling conference. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about what you said about coalitions, and as you know, there's been a split between Asian Americans and African Americans, during the Los Angeles riots and so forth. And I was wondering what ideas you had regarding, healing that rift.
I'm glad you asked that question, because a lot of Asians don't understand, but it isn't a split just with Asians, but Africans, their main thing right now is reparations, because through all these years, in the 400 years of slavery, no one even thought that it was wrong to do what Europeans and others have done. And then in the civil rights movement, many blacks, especially the nationalists, felt that the civil rights movement was diluted because it was led mostly by whites. And blacks from maybe not in the 60s, but 70s, well, 60s too, because Malcolm showed a different way. Most living in Harlem 40 years, most activists were Malcolm people, not Martin Luther King. Of course, those who were in the civil rights movement were for Martin Luther King, and I think it's wonderful that both of those leaders came up at the same time so that blacks, whites, and everyone else could assess why there were these differences. And I hope Asians will support the black reparation movement. I mean, what Africans went through was horrendous. No animals were brought back here in the way that Africans were. I mean, there are not that many books written about it because America didn't even allow it. Of course, I think maybe W.E.B. Du Bois has written a lot, but there was also one other person, and it was Ho Chi Minh. He could not get the book published here, of course. It was published in the Soviet Union. But I hope people understand that because blacks have felt they've been, not the word betrayed, but is made astray, what's the word? Go astray. What's the, that they were, well, I could only think the word misled in the movement, that they want to bring all blacks together and understand the history that their foreparents came. And it's a history that most of us do not know. So I hope you will support them. But thank you for that question.
I think we can take maybe one more. I don't want to overly tire Yuri here. Okay.
Yuri, I want to first of all thank you for taking time to join us and for your inspired message to us. My question to you is that there appears to be lack of enthusiasm for activism among many of the current generation, and even the maintenance of the status quo by many Asian groups, as evidenced by last year what happened to Wayie Ly. It took a small group of conservative individuals here in this state to raise the level of consciousness before other Asian groups joined the bandwagon. And my question specifically is, what would be your word of advice to catalyze the Asian groups today to be more proactive for various social justices and social causes?
First, I think it was good that the Wayie Ly case came about, because I think a lot of Asians felt they didn't have to worry anymore, that they wouldn't have to go through that kind of experience. And yet to think what Wayie Ly, when he was in prison for, wasn't it over a year or not quite? But to think that his reputation was smeared, even though at the end he was found not guilty. But this thing about enthusiasm, I don't know. What I have seen in the Bay Area, I am so proud of the Asian American youth. They are so, what's the word? Full of energy. I mean, it showed in those big marches, March 15th, March 5th, and the February, was it 16th? I mean, we all tried to march together, but I know when I went to the place where we were supposed to meet, there were so many people. So it shows, first of all, that the movement today against the war is big. But there were, I think, the Filipino and Korean groups both had over 100 people. And all the other Asian groups were also large. And in fact, the Asian contingent was led by the Korean, what you call them, drummers. And I don't know, every kind of event I've been up there, and I go usually with Monica, who goes everywhere, there have been just slews of Asians, isn't that right? and I think here the fact that you who organized this event and those who are here right now, it shows the kind of things that you are interested in. And I think even back in our old times, don't you think Asians were active? Or what? No? No, I feel that Asians are going to be more and more visible. So, did I answer your question? I don't know.
Well, thank you very much, Yuri. I just hope that when I'm Yuri's age, I'm still standing, much less be able to speak so passionately and knowledgeable about these issues. Let's give Yuri another big hand. I hope all of you are now sufficiently inspired for this afternoon session, which most people tend to fall asleep at. So you have some extra time, I guess. So I guess you can continue to have your...
Thank you for coming. The ARC was established in 1991 after a lot of student pressure to provide services and support for Asian American students. And one of the first things that went into the to the ARC was a library. We had a lot of donations. A lot of people willed over their entire series. Some of it we couldn't use, some of it we didn't want to use, some of it, a lot of it we could use. I mean, if you look, Roots in Asian American Reader, this is like one of the first textbooks or readers for Asian American Studies. Those were donated. We didn't buy them. We didn't buy 2 of them. We bought 1 of them. We didn't buy 2 of them. So this was made possible through a lot of generous gifts. It was made possible through faculty sharing their syllabus with us to let us know what's new in Asian American Studies. A good number of these books were made possible through the Holly Fund at Pomona College. And so it's become, through the Holly Fund. And this is a relatively impressive collection of Asian American Studies books. When friends and colleagues of mine from different institutions will come, they're pretty impressed that a little resource center like ours would have a library like this. And the other component of our library is the video collection, the video and documentary collection. Not only do we have the majority of programs sponsored by the ARC on videotape, but we also purchase a lot of documentaries. Everything from Kip Fulbeck's work to Skin Deep, Sai Gu to Turntablism, and of course probably our most popular video and the one that's checked out the most, and that's Passion for Justice, the Yuri Kochiyama story. So as we moved into the Smith Campus Center, that couch, the one that everyone jokes about, and these bookcases are really the only things that we brought with us from Oldenburg. Everything else was banned. Yeah. Yeah. We used to be located in another building, and we moved, and they gave us these $1,800 chairs, and it just didn't feel right. It still doesn't feel right. So we kept our bookcases, and we kept the couch. Over the years, there's been a lot of discussion about the programs that the ARC does, our library, the office itself, and really wanting to name a lot of these things after people. To this date, there's been only one thing that we've named something after another person, and that's the Allison De La Cruz Leadership Award. And so now we're proud to announce that this is the second thing that we're going to name at the Asian American Research Center, and that's the Yuri Kochiyama Asian American Studies Library at the Asian American Research Center. For our community, for all communities. So it was very logical for us to name our Asian American Studies Library after one of the leading civil rights activists in the country and the world, not just within the Asian American community, but across the board. So we want to unveil this plaque that will announce the new library. And it says, the Asian American Resource Center honors this library in the name of Ms. Yuri Kochiyama, in recognition of her lifetime dedication to civil rights activism for communities of color on March 24th, 2003. And then we have a quote from one of Yuri's speeches that she gave, and it reads, "Educating is consciousness raising. Education is learning about history, often history that is not taught by those in power. And the young must learn the truth and continue the struggle." So we will put this up, and today marks the first day of the Yuri Kochiyama Asian American Studies Library. I don't know, Yuri, if you want to say a few words or...
Thank you. It's such a, flattering and surprising, and my goodness, I don't know what to say, but I happen to have brought a book, and could I donate it to your...
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and I hope all of you will read it, although my whole family isn't too keen about it. Wait a minute, what's this state? And it's written by a San Francisco writer, Don Paul. It is quite a radical book. In fact, many bookstores don't even want to take it. They're so afraid that they might get in trouble. But it's a very, very intriguing book. Maybe you could call it, what do you call it? Conspiracy theory? But this guy did a lot of research, Don Paul. He writes for the San Francisco Bayview, and he's a Stanford grad who's a marathoner. He's done all kind of things. But I think he's really brought out some very important things in this book, and I hope some of you will take it out and read it. And thank you, Darren, and all the rest of you for honoring me like this.
The Asian American Resource Center officially renamed the library, the Asian American Studies Library in our office, the Yuri Kochiyama Asian American Studies Library. So I wanted to make that announcement. We couldn't think of a more appropriate person to name a library after, someone who's dedicated their entire life to civil rights, educating others, and fighting for justice for other people. So I just wanted to make that announcement. So come by the library and check it out.
Just to give you a brief introduction of our speaker tonight, Ms. Yuri Kochiyama was born in San Pedro, California in 1921. At age 21, she, like many other Japanese Americans during World War II, was forced to move to an internment camp for 2 years. When she moved to New York, she became actively involved with various civil rights organizations. She has seen an incredible 4 decades of activist experience and has been actively involved with the Black Panther Party and has even worked very closely with Malcolm X during the civil rights movement. She also took part in the Puerto Rican nationalist movement for independence from the United States and joined 28 other members in a nonviolent takeover of the Statue of Liberty in 1977 to demand the release of Puerto Rican political prisoners. She was also one of the earliest grassroots activists involved with the emergent Asian American movement in the 60s and has fought for issues like workers' rights and reparations for Japanese Americans after their experiences in World War II. She has worked with such organizations like Asian Americans for Action and the Asian Coalition Against the Vietnam War. Even at age 81, she still remains active with the Asian American community, a true testament to her spirit and enthusiasm. She is truly a role model for the young Asian American activists of our generation. Her video biography, titled Yuri Kochiyama, Passion for Justice, is available at the Asian American Resource Center Video Library for viewing. And if any of you are interested, it's a terrific documentary that outlines her experiences with the activist communities. In consideration of the current war in Iraq, there is now a more perfect time for her visit to Pomona College to address this issue and how it affects Asian Americans today and in the future. So without further ado, please welcome Ms. Yuri Kochiyama.
I wish to first thank Darren Moko and Robert Cocaine and Felicia and all the other people on the committee who worked so hard to get people to come here tonight. And I got the surprise of my life when I see 2 friends over there, and they're very well known. You've got a couple of stars here. They're actors, and they're very well known. It's Greg Watanabe and Tamlin Tomita. And they're sitting right there. Thanks for coming. Last week, I didn't know if war would have started by now or not, but I knew I still wanted to speak about the wars. Well, I'm speaking more about not 9/11 as much as just U.S. wars in general, U.S. pretexts, U.S. policies. The war has now started, and I'm sure that every one of you had your eyes glued to the TV on March 19, just as you did on 9/11. It's very confusing hearing daily news reports on the war, because several months ago I thought Bush said this is going to be a long war. And then last week I heard the White House report saying, and it had just started, and it said that, oh, this is going to be a short war, that already thousands of Iraqi soldiers have surrendered. I wonder if that's true. Day by day, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. I feel we must all learn the truth about wars before we are all muzzled. I want to begin with American wars in the 20th century. America seems to have a formula for war, a sort of pattern of first demonizing a target to generate anger and suspicion. To be able to honestly understand a nation and what it stands for, you will never be able to do it by reading the Constitution, its Declaration of Independence, or its aims and purposes. Most all constitutions sound reasonable, doable, even admirable, and sometimes inspiring. To really access a country or government or organization or even an individual, to really know what they're like, you must watch the actions he or she takes, the kind of practice he or she is engaged in, not what he or she says or what an organization says. Let's go back to the last 100 years. The U.S. has involved itself in many wars throughout the 20th century. She has often used ruses and false pretexts. So have other countries, especially imperialist countries who want to expand its power. Government complicity and deception is U.S. government's most skilled weapon. That applies to Europe and also Japan. In 1884 and 85, Europe carved up Africa at the infamous Berlin Conference. No African countries were even invited. That was the beginning of Western racist attitudes towards Africans and Africa. In the Spanish-American War of 1898, it began with the U.S. battleship the Maine, which blew up in Havana Harbor in Cuba. U.S. accused Spain, although it was the U.S.'s own doing, and with the slogan, "Remember the Maine," rushed into war under the pretext of liberating Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. After betraying those countries, she suppressed the resistance. Philippines was the most devastated of those three countries, with 1 million civilians being massacred. Black soldiers, who number 6,000 in Theodore Roosevelt's army, were so stunned by the atrocities that one of the black leaders named Fagan said to his black comrades, "We're fighting on the wrong side," and then led his black comrades up in the mountains and joined the Filipino guerrillas. A Filipino filmmaker, Rene Untal, has finished a docudrama of this history. I hope all of you will try to see it. Of course, those black soldiers could never come back to this country. They would have been executed for treason and sabotage. They stayed in the Philippines, married Filipino women, and started their families. In 1915, a passenger ship, the Lusitania, was sunk by a German submarine because the Germans got suspicious and felt the American ship was carrying more than just passengers. And she was. Breaking war laws, U.S. packed artillery shells, rifle cartridges, and millions of rounds of other ammunition. Over 1,000 people died. Looking for an excuse to follow Britain in this First World War, the U.S. used these civilians, allowing them to come on that ship, but used as human cover while it violated its own claims of neutrality. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes bombed Pearl Harbor. U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called it the Day of Infamy. U.S. had already annexed the Hawaiian Islands and turned it into a massive military base to control China and the Philippines. The U.S. had purposely made war in the Pacific by cutting off Japanese oil and scrap iron in the months preceding Pearl Harbor, projecting and extending American imperial power in rivalry with the other imperialists. U.S. sacrificed the lives of 2,300 American sailors. The Japanese, also imperialist nation, also sacrificed its kamikaze pilots. In the 1930s, Japan committed one of the most horrendous massacres in the world. It was in Nanking, China, killing 300,000 people, which is more than Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. In 1963, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place. By denying key facts, Adlai Stevenson swore to the UN that U.S. was not involved, and it was a complete lie. As the CIA launched an armed CIA invasion into Cuba. Since then, of course, Cuba had good reasons never to trust the U.S. U.S. also put sanctions on Cuba to try to starve that small, poor country that has given more to the world than any other countries in her medical care, her doctors, her teachers, than any other country. In 1964, the White House and Pentagon charged the torpedo gunboats from the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam that is, had launched an unprovoked attack on the U.S. fleet in Tonkin Bay. This was another total lie. But the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that authorized U.S. troops into southern Vietnam. It was the start of that long 10-year Vietnam War. U.S. was not going to allow Vietnam to choose its own preference of a government because Vietnam was communist. Over 2 million Vietnamese, mostly poor peasants, died. U.S. death toll was 50,000. Despite poverty and poor living conditions in Vietnam, Vietnam took on the U.S. military monstrosity. It was like a David and Goliath battle. The fighting spirit and the leadership of Ho Chi Minh kept reminding his people, independence is life's most precious treasure. Ho's soldiers fought until national independence and sovereignty was won. But the South Vietnamese allied with the U.S. military. They lost, but most of the American soldiers who fought there had hardly any inkling of what they were fighting for. North Vietnam's victory was an inspiration to third world countries that a victory over a mighty white nation was possible for people of color. In 1983, when Ronald Reagan was the president, he announced that the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada was being taken over by the Cuban military. Reagan launched Operation Urgent Fury, sending 7,000 troops to invade that tiny island because of the rumors of Cubanos coming in. No reporters, however, were allowed on that island. There were casualties, but no one knew the number. They knew that probably it was all the Cubanos who were being killed. The Cubans, however, turned out to be construction workers, not guerrillas or soldiers. They came to help Grenada build a new airport. Reagan later had the audacity to quip, U.S. had to take Grenada because it is the world's biggest producer of nutmeg, and you can't make good eggnog without good nutmeg. But as an aside, I want you to know that many white radical activists were so angry at the invasion of Grenada that they attempted to bomb the Pentagon. These white radicals were all arrested and spent long years in prison. Well, half of them are still in. And Marilyn Buck, who is one in a California prison, is doing 80 years. As you learn more and more about America, you will understand the innate character of the U.S. government and policies. I didn't say American people, but the U.S. government. But unfortunately, I think a whole lot of Americans are like the U.S. government. But Malcolm always said to distinguish the trees from the forest. And that's what we must learn to do whenever we might find something to condemn a country or criticize. In 1990, Colin Powell first talked about a war over Iraq's takeover of Kuwait. He said it would be impossible to get support over war with Iraq, but he said, I think the American people would go to war if Iraq invaded Saudi Arabia. The U.S. government claimed that Iraq was planning to invade Saudi Arabia just because Colin Powell made that statement. The U.S. said it had classified satellite photographs from, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, satellite photographs, sorry people, wow, okay. A satellite photograph from September 1990 that showed that 265,000 Iraqi soldiers and 1,500 tanks were massing on the Saudi Arabia border. The investigative reporters checked commercial satellite photos to see if this was true. There were no soldiers massing on the Saudi Arabia border. A year later, Paul admitted that there had been no massive buildup. But by then, U.S. had bombed Iraq and established huge permanent bases in Saudi Arabia. And in 42 days, the U.S. military crushed Iraq. One of the worst propaganda material to hit the press was in November of 1990, when a 15-year-old Kuwait girl sat before a U.S. congressional committee and told a heart-rending story of cruelty. She said she was a volunteer nurse who personally watched Iraqi soldiers throw out babies out of the incubators in the Al Adnan hospital in Kuwait City and leave them on the floor to die. President Bush then mentioned this incubator stories in 5 of his speeches. A Filipino nurse who slept in the Kuwaiti incubator room with the infants later said, I remember someone called and said, look at CNN, they are talking about us. She turned on the TV to see a young woman tell about the horrible stories of the poor little incubator babies. The Filipino nurse said, "That's funny. We've never seen her. She never worked here." The incubator testimony was a total hoax. It was a brainchild of a public relations firm. Can you open it? Wait. Firm hired for $2 million by the Kuwaiti monarchy. Is this it? Wait a minute, how do you do?